Te quiero. Okay, this video is Aristotle made easy to understand. That I'm making this video to help a dear friend of mine get started in studying the Greeks, okay? And sort of like the beginning of studying the Greeks to have an idea of the difference between Aristotle and Plato. This painting you see here, Raphael, School of Athens, it's in the Stanza Signatura in the Vatican. It's my background here as well. And right in the center of the painting, here is Plato. Plato, of course, was older than Aristotle. He was Aristotle's teacher, and he's pointing up to the sky, to the heavens, because Plato's big theory was the idea of the perfect forms that exist only in heaven. And a chair that we sit in is just an example of a chair, but the perfect chair is in heaven. And Plato was very abstract, sort of a mystic. A lot of people believe that Platonism is a giant part of influencing Christian philosophy, and to some extent it is. Platonism largely goes down the path of Augustine to Luther. Aristotelianism goes largely down the path of Aquinas to the Renaissance, okay, and to Pope Julius and all these beautiful painting and everything else, okay, and Catholicism. I like Aristotelian Christianity much better than Platonic Christianity, Augustinian Christianity. Anyways, Aristotle in this painting is saying, down, let's focus on what's here on earth and not worry so much about what's up in heaven. Okay? And they are the two most important philosophers who ever lived. And very often, different points of view are described as being Aristotelian or as being Platonic. Okay? So Plato being older, he had lived through the loss of Athens to Sparta, and that's why he gave a little more favoritism to collectivism than he should have. Okay? Aristotle had grown up very lonely, and so he was very studious as a way to entertain himself. He was an orphan when he was 11 years old. Okay. Here, by the way, is Socrates talking with Alcibiades and some other young scholars, like in a typical Platonic dialogue, like in Plato's Republic. Okay. Here's Diogenes, the homeless philosopher, sitting on the stairs. Okay. Here's Heraclitus, another Greek philosopher, which is really Michelangelo. Raphael put him in the painting in honor of him. Okay, and this idea of a painting showing the magnificent Roman architecture populated by Greek scholars, philosophers, scientists, architects, engineers, was showing the synergistic, meaning the combination, unity of the Catholic Church with the knowledge that had come from the ancient Greeks and Romans. And that's a wonderful thing about the Catholic Church is it doesn't just reject everybody else. It learns from them. It didn't just get rid of paganism. It adopted paganism, okay, which is actually a beautiful thing. All right, now Aristotle went on to form his own school, and his school was called the Lyceum. Plato's school had been called the Academy, and he walked around a lot with his students, and that's called peripatetic, to walk around. So that was another name for Aristotle's eventual school, was the peripatetics, walking around and learning. You remember well when you walk around. It's a normal thing to do, like doctors make rounds with the residents and the medical students. Okay. Here's the magnificent book, and it's the best book of philosophy ever written, called The Cave and the Light. And it was written by Arthur Herman. He's sort of a historian, and again, you have the painting of Plato and Aristotle from Stanza Signatura, the School of Athens by Raphael, painted in 1511 in the Vatican. Okay, greatest philosophy book ever written. And what it does is it contrasts all through history the different events and how they are influenced in some cases by Platonism, in some cases by Aristotle, Aristotelianism. Ayn Rand, the greatest female philosopher who ever lived, said Aristotle is by far the greatest philosopher who ever lived. And that's been pretty much universally agreed on by most educated people who believe in freedom. Okay, Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, basically baptized Aristotle, if you will, and he's accepted his teachings into the Catholic Church in a big way. And Aristotle's writings shaped all of Western civilization, education for more than 1,500 years after that. Okay, he's the most influential philosopher who ever lived, him and Plato. To be a Westerner is pretty much to think in an Aristotelian way. Here's Arthur Herman, the author of The Cave and the Light. Okay, here was a painting later on of Aristotle had been to Macedonia, left Macedonia to come to Athens and study with Plato. And then here's a painting. He went back to Macedonia. Aristotle's father, by the way, is Nicomachus. He had been the doctor for the king of his time, Amyntas. Okay, now here's the young Alexander the Great going to be the student of Aristotle. Okay. Alexander the Great went on to be one of the greatest generals and commanders of all time, and he captured most of the semi-civilized world of those days. And he was such an admirer of Aristotle and the Greeks that he spread Hellenism, Greek philosophy and thought, all throughout these conquered areas. And all throughout history, that's pretty much what has happened. The most powerful peoples have conquered a bunch of adjacent places. That was a normal thing to do. That's just how mankind is. Okay, here is Aristotle teaching Alexander the Great, the young man. And Alexander the Great was very intelligent. He was a genius, a military genius, one of the greatest generals of all time. He was still, though, at heart, a bit of a barbarian, of course. Oh, and Diogenes was a very funny, clever, homeless philosopher, which I showed you a moment ago in that painting. And Plato had defined man as a featherless biped. So Diogenes, the young homeless philosopher of that day, plucked the feathers off a chicken, and the chicken walks on two legs. So he said, here is Aristotle's idea. I'm sorry, here is Plato's idea of a man. Okay, here's also, and Alexander the Great really liked Diogenes. He saw him in the street and he said, Diogenes, is there anything I could do for you? I'll grant you any wish you request. Diogenes said, you're blocking my sunlight. Get out of the way. Okay, now Aristotle developed the modern classification system for animals. So here is Aristotle at his desk. Here's Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great knew that he was a big collector of animal specimens. Aristotle invented the system of genus and species for animal classification. He was a biologist first and foremost, okay? He had been expected to become a doctor like his father, and he would have if his father hadn't died so soon. So he would dissect all these animals and classify them. And this is another example of how they worked together to expand the knowledge of the world. He had a very advanced collection of animals. Here is Thomas Aquinas, the unifier of faith and reason, again, who baptized Aristotle and made his teaching acceptable to the Catholic Church, because there were different ways to interpret his teaching, some of them less favorable to religion and Christianity. Okay. And by the way, I think Aristotle was the greatest philosopher who ever lived. This is Aristotle in the movie The Agony and the Ecstasy when he's painting the School of Athens. Okay, it's a magnificent movie. Okay, Charlton Heston is Michelangelo. Okay, I think Rex Harrison is Pope Julius. Okay, and here is the painting in the movie. And this is when Rex Harrison, Pope Julius, sees the School of Athens being painted and how magnificent it is. There's Raphael at that time. There's Raphael at that time. It's one of his assistants. And it was, it's one of the greatest paintings of all time. It's considered the high point of the Renaissance, the high water mark of the Renaissance. And I love that painting so much. This is at my old house, the one my ex-wife stole away from me. I had a copy of the painting of the School of Athens in my bathroom. I had all these paintings I loved. They called it the Magic Bathroom because they inspired me. Seeing all these great paintings in my bathroom every day, all these people I admired, great writers, painters, philosophers, and thinkers. Socrates and Plato had lived around the time of the high point of Athens, the golden age of Athens. Here's Pericles, the great statesman of Athens, who would help build the Acropolis. There's the Parthenon, up the statue of Athena up on the hill, the city on a hill. Okay, sort of the high point of culture in the entire world at that time. Okay, here's a painting of Pythagoras, who was the founder of the vegetarian diet, and also the Pythagorean theorem and mathematics, a lot of ideas about mathematics, and Plato was very much influenced by him. Okay, and that's part of where his idea of the perfect forms came from too. So I show you these things here. This is Asclepius. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, of medicine. And it was thought that Nicomachus, the father of Aristotle, was a descendant from Asclepius. And so that was a big thing of pride for the ancient Greeks. Okay, so this was instilled. They had expected the young Aristotle to become the next doctor in the line of the Asclepiades, was a group of men who trained in the ways of Asclepius, which included, making rounds on patients, making observations about patients, studying things in the real world in front of them. How does the patient respond to this treatment? Let's follow them up. An empirical perspective, meaning a trial and error perspective, like a scientific method perspective. I think this will work. Let's give it a try. Let's see what happens. Did it work? Yes. Great. Wonderful. We'll try it with the next patient. It didn't work. Well, let's try something else. That experimental method is called the empirical method, and Aristotle was big on that. All right, so I wanted to give you all that background so Aristotle would make sense. So the bottom line is Plato was driven by trying to resolve the sadness and conflicts of his youth. You know, seeing Sparta conquer Athens, seeing Socrates, his great teacher, the greatest man in Athens, be killed, seeing himself try to be a politician and get sold into slavery, seeing himself fail as a playwright. So then he wrote philosophy in the form of plays, with Socrates as the hero, to vindicate Socrates and to give the Greeks an example of a new type of hero, an intellectual hero. And he was very big on math and perfect forms, a bit of a mystic. He had these great metaphors like the ring of Gyges. If you could make yourself invisible, put this ring on, okay? And then with the ring on, you're invisible. Would you still be moral, okay? The allegory of the cave, the allegory of the mythical city of Atlantis, his theoretical ideal of the republic, how man should be governed, what is justice, okay? Whereas Plato was quite different. So Plato was an aristocratic family. Aristotle was quite different. He came from Macedon, not from Greek proper. And Aristotle was basically an outsider all his life. He was never allowed to become a citizen of Athens. He wasn't even allowed to own property in Athens, okay? And he was just a magnificent genius, but he was always an outsider and always kind of looked down upon. And after Alexander the Great had died, Aristotle was chased out of Athens, and he died 1 year after that, became sick and died. The big thing that drove Aristotle was a desire to know, a desire to understand. And he sought his knowledge based on direct observation. He was always classifying animal specimens and then observing things. He decided, too, to try to summarize the useful knowledge of his time. He summarized all the Greek rhetoric. He summarized what he knew about the Greek plays. He summarized, he developed his own method of logic, and he summarized what was known about logic, what was known about ethics, about metaphysics, about biology. He had a giant library at school. So basically, the driving force of Aristotle was to know, and also in part to overcome his own loneliness. He wanted to study. It made him happy. And he said contemplation is the greatest of all joys, because unlike the other pleasures in life, it does not wax and wane. You can enjoy reading and studying and thinking all day long, day after day. You can only make the two-back beast for a couple of minutes, and it's fun, but then life goes on. Okay, you can only eat for about an hour or two, and then life goes on. But you can read and think and study and contemplate all day long. And he felt that contemplation and study and thinking were the highest activities of man, because they are the most godlike. The animals can't think and contemplate, but only man can. So that is his highest thing he can do. And to be a philosopher is to think and contemplate all day long. So philosophers are the best men, the highest of all men. And so that's pretty typical that somebody thinks that what they do is the greatest thing a person could do. And Aristotle was no exception, okay? And he felt to be a Greek was the great honor. The Greeks were the smartest people in the world, the most cultured people in the world, the most sophisticated people in the world, the best scientists, the best philosophers, the best scholars. Aristotle was a prolific writer, and he had his own library of all the books and scrolls of his time, and he made many of his own. When Aristotle died, because he wasn't really a Greek, didn't own property, his lyceum kind of fell apart. He had one student who continued it for some years, but never in an advanced way like Aristotle had, and most of his books were lost. Over 75% of his writings were lost. Unlike Plato, where most of his books were preserved, most of Aristotle's writings, about 75% of them, were lost. But despite that, they still were the foundation of the whole academic system for the next 1,500 years. And, in multiple other areas, he just developed things. In politics, he studied all the constitution of the different city-states. He really advanced knowledge more than anybody who ever lived. So anyways, I give you this background. I got a couple more picture slides to show you, but I'm making the point that he was the driving force of individualism, of seeking knowledge, of the truth based on observation, study, and experimentation here on planet Earth, whereas Plato was often philosophizing about what's up in the sky and promoted a collectivist mindset with eugenics and control from above, whereas Aristotle was much more, let the individual do his own thing. He, as an outsider, was an individual and wanted to be able to do his own creative work, which he did to great benefit for the whole world. So that's why I like Aristotle a lot more than Plato, because Aristotle celebrates individualism, development of your own self, of your mind, so you can do things that are more interesting and more enjoyable to you, and you're more able to help other people. Okay, so that all comes from Aristotelianism. Ayn Rand had said it herself, that Aristotle's way of thinking and living improved whatever society it encountered. Aristotle summarized Greek work in things like theater and plays. He felt that Oedipus Rex by Sophocles was the greatest play ever written. And he would take something like rhetoric and he would improve upon it, and speech. And he would talk about, he's famous for talking about logos, ethos, pathos, and kairos, timing, how to give a speech and what that all means. He was, he developed the whole syllogism, methods of logic, the understanding of causations, way to tell if somebody's telling the truth versus lying. He did tons of stuff. We're not going to go into all that today. I just wanted you to get a general sense of him. But a lot of people, myself included, think he's the smartest person who ever lived. Him, and then probably Isaac Newton would be number two. But Aristotle, he summarized all the knowledge of the world up to his time. It's magnificent. And he had some overlap in his life with Hippocrates. Aristotle was born in 384 BC. Hippocrates died in 370, so he would only have been 14 years old when Hippocrates died, but he would also have had some influence likely on his father, Nicomachus, the great doctor. These are just a couple of slides of Hippocrates. Oh, there is a funny story about Aristotle when this one pretty lady kind of took advantage of him, Phyllis. We don't have time to go into that story right now, but that's just a funny, entertaining story. Here, I'll show you one more picture of Phyllis. And of course, this is a story. I don't know if she actually had a whip in her hand, but people found that funny, that the smartest man in the world could be controlled by a woman. Sometimes I wonder if a woman is not something like a machine God invented to empty out a man's wallet. But anyways, I hope you find that helpful. Aristotle was great. Aristotle was nice. Aristotle promoted the individual. He had respect for the outsider like himself. Give the other person a chance. Let them develop. And he did a fantastic job teaching the student and developing a system of how to develop one's mind. So anyways, I hope you found that helpful.